Welcome back to the Broadman Word, and we are diving into the first plague of the plagues in Egypt today in Exodus chapter 7, verses 14 through 25, if you want to turn there with me. We are going to see the first plague, which is all about the Nile River, and we're going to see the water turned into blood. And an interesting detail there with that first plague that I think is often maybe overlooked, but then also God starts to show a behind the scenes purpose for the plagues in Egypt. And that purpose, I think, is all to show that God is the only true God as he faces off not just against Pharaoh with Moses, with Moses and Aaron being with God. But I think it's a lot more than just against Pharaoh. I think it's also against gods and goddesses. There you go, gods and goddesses of of Egypt. So we're going to take a look at that today with the Nile River, the first plague. So let's dive right in with Exodus chapter 7, verses 14 through 19. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Quick pause here. We are going to take a look specifically at what it means when Pharaoh's heart is hardened. We're going to look at that on Thursday. So, for today's purpose, it's basically he is not going to let the Israelite people go. He is holding firm to that. But we'll go more into details with what that might actually mean, the hardening of the hearts, on Thursday. Verse 15. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water, and stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him. Take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent, and you shall say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, By this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. And the Lord said to Moses, Say to Aaron, Take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, their canals, and their ponds, and all their pools of water, so that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. All right, so quick pause there. Really, really interesting stuff with the first plague. So you go after the Nile River. And why is that exactly, though? Why the Nile River? The Nile River was extremely sacred to ancient Egypt. Not only was it an agricultural must have, but it also had a lot of religious, just a lot of religious significance as well. For instance, in ancient Egypt, they actually believed that the Nile was the bloodstream of one of the gods of Egypt, one of the ancient gods of Egypt named Osiris. And we'll get to him in just a second at the end of the first plague. But yeah, so there's a lot of significance to the Nile River agriculturally, religiously, biologically. There's a lot of need for the Nile River to succeed, to survive, to sustain. And so there's a lot of need for the Nile River. But it has been turned into blood, or that is the decree that God is giving to Moses to tell Pharaoh, and then verses 20 through 25 are the working out of that. So we're just in the decree section from God to Moses and Aaron to then tell Pharaoh. And we're just setting it up. But the plague, though, is to turn water into blood. And that would cause a lot of issues in the economy of ancient Egypt. It would cause some issues in the religious realm of ancient Egypt. Doing this would have a lot of consequences. And I think it makes a lot of sense, with that being said, why the Nile River is the first plague and not something like frogs or gnats or flies that we'll look at later on. I think it makes a lot of sense why the Nile River is the first plague itself. But I think there's another reason as well, which we'll get to in a second. But it's not also, and again, I just want to make this clear, it's not just the Nile River. Verse 19 shows that the water that's coming from the Nile River has a broad impact on everything else. And when it says, too, that it's going to be this way throughout all the land of Egypt in verse 19, that does actually contain the land where the Israelites are being kept, are living as slaves, and that is in the land of Goshen. So they are not exempt from this plague, which we'll get into as we get into the plagues. The first few would actually still impact the Israelites, but then at a certain point, they only impacted the Egyptians, and we'll take a look at that later on. But verse 20, now we'll see the actual action of getting the plague started. Verse 20, Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went to his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. All right, so we have a couple things that are interesting here. First off, they had to drink something, especially with verse 25, which we'll get to in a second, how long this took place. But they had to drink something, so they actually would go into the land and would start to dig holes, hoping that they could find a source of water. They probably also spent time with traders, trading for water as well. Again, this plague had a very broad amount of consequence tied to it. And again, yes, it is trying to get the attention of Pharaoh and saying, okay, are you really going to mess with the God of the Hebrews, who is the only true God? Or are you going to continue to not listen to him? And well, he doesn't at the end of the first plague. In verse 22, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Verse 23, Pharaoh turned and went to his house, and he did not take even this to heart. Is just this continuation of stubbornness. But we're also, again, going to talk about the hardening of heart on Thursday. The other thing that I think is important to see here is the secret purpose behind the plagues, and is to show that God is the only true God. And so he is at war with the gods and goddesses. I don't know if there's a better way to say that. Goddesses of ancient Egypt. And this is really, really interesting, by the way. Every single plague actually has a connection to an ancient god or goddess. And if you want more information on those, you can absolutely find ancient Egyptian literature or programs wherever. But one of my favorites, though, is Metro Books's the Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt. This is a great source, resource of information. This is edited by Helen Strudwick. So this is a really interesting thing to use. And in this encyclopedia on ancient Egypt, you have the section on religion. And what's really interesting with the Nile River, there is two and maybe a third god or goddess that is connected with the Nile River. So we'll start with Khnum. Khnum is a god that would appear as a ram. He was very much connected with the Nile. He was connected with the Nile because he is very much connected to the fertile soil of the Nile because he is a potter god. It's very interesting with Khnum. He also is often seen as a creator as well. And so again, makes sense why God would start here in order to see or to show that Khnum is not on the same level as the God of the Hebrews. The other one is called Happy, and Happy is very weird, but very interesting. Happy is also the god of the Nile. Now, Happy does happen a little bit later in ancient Egyptian history. Sometime around the 19th dynasty is when we see the oldest depictions of Happy occurring. Whereas the Israelites living in ancient Egypt as slaves, sometime in the 13th century BC, a lot of early dates are around 1450 BC. And so is it possible that Happy may not have been a thought of ancient Egyptian religion at that time? It is possible. But my guess is it's probably a combination of the two, Khnum and Happy. Now there was a third one, and that is Osiris himself. The Nile was seen as the bloodstream of Osiris. Osiris is the god of death, resurrection, and fertility. So it would make sense why he would be connected to the Nile River. And he absolutely very well could be thought of within this idea of God plaguing the Nile River. But my guess is it's more thought to be a combination of Khnum and Happy when we think about the Nile River and the plague that comes upon the Nile River. So, a lot of fertility, a lot of life going on with the Nile River, and God is just making a grand statement, not just to the Egyptians, but to the Israelites as well, that not only am I the only true God, but I also am actually the true God over everything that you see on the earth, including things that give a lot of life, like the Nile River. And so I think that's really interesting to see with the first plague and kind of a secret battle that is going on outside of the Lord, Moses, and Aaron versus Pharaoh. And so we're going to take a look at all the other plagues, and we'll see that connection as we go along. Now, there is a final point that we have to look at, and that's verse 25. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. Now, I don't believe that is just a throwaway line that is just added for fun's sake or something like that. I think that being added there is incredibly important. And yet, I think we very often just glance over it. Now, why is that important? One, with biblical numerology, you have seven being a very, very important number in Scripture. It's showing the completion of this plague. The fact that it lasted 7 days specifically, kind of the idea. You could also make it from just a work standpoint, a full week of work is past, and that would be really interesting to take a look at. But the other thing that I think is noticeable about this line is the fact that they had to get water from somewhere during these 7 days, or they would have to possibly drink from the blood itself, which is gross, and I don't want to think about that. But they had to find water, and so that's where you get verse 24, and all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. And the reason why they need to do that in verse 24 is because the length of time that is going on with the Nile River being blood in verse 25 being 7 days. I think that is an incredibly important, just a small but very incredibly important detail that sometimes we overlook with the plagues in Egypt. So just wanted to point that out with verse 25 and the first plague in Egypt. So with that being said, thanks for being with me today as we walk through the first plague in Egypt, the connection between the Nile and the Egyptian gods or goddesses of, of Khnum, of Hapi, and of Osiris, and the importance of the Nile River, and the consequences that this plague was bringing upon the country itself and the land of Egypt. And yet throughout all of that, Pharaoh does not does not stop hardening his heart, which then leads us into the big question: what does it mean that when it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart? And we will get to that on Thursday. But thanks for spending a little bit of time with me today as we looked at the first plague. I will see you Thursday. Thanks.